Hey guys, it's Lumen02. So, I had an odd inquiry from player SpencerBot15, and what it was in regards to is he runs a format called Squire. Squire is essentially Pauper that is a pointed 60 card system where essentially you play Pauper, but you have 10 points, which a point allows you to play one uncommon. And there are certain cards that have higher point scalings, but each generalized uncommon would be 1 point out of 10. So you could play up to basically, in a general rule would be a rule of thumb would be you could play 10 uncommons, basically in a Pauper deck. What he stated was that he thought that Squire, which is the format that I just kind of loosely described, played out a lot like Old School. So what we ended up doing is he wanted to try a game against an Old School deck, which I have here. It's actually the deck, so we could test it out. I did not think his statement was accurate, but despite proving that it was likely inaccurate, we also actually saw some interesting things during the game that really tie back into design trend at Wizards. So this is our initial keep. We're playing an Old School deck, so it is powered. It is playing cards that are Fallen Empires and earlier, so basically the end of 94. I believe that's November of 94. We have the best card in the Old School format, or at least I think it's the best card in the Old School format, in the form of Library of Alexandria. It's essentially James Day Tome, but free to use. You lose like 1 mana a turn using it. So it's pretty damn good. We lead off with that. I have no clue what kind of deck he's playing. We're on the draw as well, which is actually nice when you have a library hand. He goes ahead and fetches with an Evolving Wilds, finds an island, I believe preordains here, which I think we just draw in response to because we figure he's not casting another card. And he goes ahead and concedes it. Even in Vintage, where you have Force of Will, stuff like that, turn 1 library can be enough to break the blue mirror. So this is kind of a first sign that design trend has significantly changed. Obviously now, not even that long after, I think Brainstorm was made in Ice Age, and then I believe Portent was shortly thereafter. Or maybe I have a mixed match. Maybe it was Portent in Ice Age, then Brainstorm thereafter. I think it was Brainstorm in Ice Age, though. We didn't have cantrips in Old School Magic. You basically how you drew cards were from Ancestral Recall, which I guess is the world's best cantrip, burst draw capability in a card like Brain Geyser, and then really it was Tome and Library that allowed you to actually draw cards. The way you accrued card advantage was generally through cards like Moat, Wrath of God, Mind Twist, the Abyss, all of which this deck has access to, whether they're in main or board. So when a card like Library of Alexandria drops, I think it just breaks the game here. I believe he said he couldn't find land. But this game really wasn't that interesting or telling on kind of how design trend has changed. I think Game 2 actually shows some pretty interesting things about design trend in general. As time has gone on, threats have become much more efficient and much more powerful. What I would say about Old School, though, is that the threats are, generally speaking, not that great. You're looking at Flying Men, Serendib Efreets, sometimes Serendib Jin, Sierra Angel, Shivan Dragon, Urnum Jin, Sengir Vampire maybe, Juzam Jin, the Knights, the Pump Knights, White Knight, Black Knight. If you're looking at White Weenie, maybe Acacian Javelineers, possibly Tundra Wolves. All those seem kind of bad to me, though. But in general, they're generally not that efficient. They're generally not that great, and they cost a lot of mana. Now, you start contrasting those threats with the threats we have nowadays, and I think how you have to do it is, I think Serendib Efreet may be one of the best threats in Old School. It passes the Bolt test, it's a 3/4 flying, it does 1 damage to you, but it's 3 mana, it's very efficient for the time frame. But compare that card to Delver of Secrets. Delver of Secrets is a 3/2, does not pass the Bolt test, but can come down under general or normal mana development 2 turns before the Serendib Efreet can. And 2 turns is a lot when you're looking at 6 additional damage on top of that. So the deck we're playing actually doesn't have any creature threats whatsoever. On the sideboard it has Sierra Angels. We didn't board them in. I don't think the Sierra Angels are actually good in this matchup. I think his deck is going to be much more efficient than mine is, but I think mine is going to be more powerful, so I'm going to rely on my power. So what I ended up doing here is this is a keep. I threw the first hand back. It didn't do anything. I keep this Game Day Tome on top, and what my plan is to play it out actually turn 1, and then set up to Demonic Tutor, depending on what I draw the following turn, either for Soul Ring or a Moxen, so that I can activate the Game Day Tome and just start outdrawing my opponent. Additionally, this sets up what I assume is going to be one of my power cards in this matchup, which is Balance. Because more modern day Magic, in this case, this Squire deck he's playing has far better threats like Delver of Secrets, which I assume he is playing, like Cloud of Fairies, which is a Pauper staple, like Ninja of the Deep Hours, like Young Pyromancer. These cards are all like, well, maybe with the exception of the Cloud of Fae, but all the other threats are actually pretty damn good. Spire Golems, they're all pretty damn good threats for the rate you're paying for them. And I don't have enough counter spells to counter all of them. I'm not running Wrath of God in this deck. I'm running the Abyss. So if my opponent is able to overwhelm me early with fast creature flood, like a horizontal grow style strategy, I know for a fact that the Abyss, which is in this deck, is not going to be able to keep up at the rate I need it to keep the board clear. So what I want to do is get this Game Day Tome, dump my hand as fast as I can, use Demonic Tutor next turn, and then set up a quick Balance with a very low hand size so I can attrit his hand and kill off any early threats he gets. So that's kind of the tact I take going into this. He goes ahead and ponders on turn 1, I assume either looking for lands or looking for threats. Depends on what his hand looks like. We go ahead and play out the Game Day Tome. He plays on a Young Pyromancer, so as you can see, 2 mana goes a long ways. Young Pyromancer, if you've been under a rock, is one hell of a threat. We end up drawing the land in Mishra's Factory, so I end up going for the Mox Sapphire. That could have been wrong, but I didn't want to risk having my Soul Ring get countered on the following turn. I'm not playing Mana Crypt in this deck because this deck is not fast, and Mana Crypt would likely kill me. If I do go for the Soul Ring on the following turn, the chance he counters it, I don't know. I don't know how much he's played against Soul Ring, but if he did, it would be pretty backbreaking. So I don't go that line. What I want to do is just set up the Game Day Tome and just start outdrawing him until I can get him to a tap-out situation, and then I can actually resolve this Balance. So he goes ahead and plinks in for 2. When he does nothing else, I'm pretty positive that he's on counter magic, so I just pass it back. I assume he's got Rebs, Bebs, Counterspell, something. So I just decide to take 1 damage a turn from my own City of Brass. You may ask yourself, why are you playing Cities of Brass? Well, this is a 5-color control deck, and because it's all pre-1995, basically 94, 93 cards, there's no fetch lands. If you're playing 5-color, you have to be playing the ABU lands plus, City of Brass to fix. So my mana base is quite painful, and actually it was funny, Spencer Bot was commenting on that, but there really wasn't a better option to play this deck. It allows it to run. And you'll note throughout this game I take most of the damage from my own lands. He goes ahead and counterspells my Swords to Plowshares, which actually I'm happy with. I was trying to get that out of his hand because I want to set up the Balance. I actually want him to overextend and use the Balance to get him out of this. Now, I do draw here, which may be folly because it's going to mean that my Balance is less effective, but I think I need to use my mana there, and if I find something that's not a Disenchant, which likely should have come out, then I'll use it. And actually, yeah, Disenchant should have come out. That's not very good here. That was my bad. I probably should have brought in more Bebs. We find a Lightning Bolt, which is pretty cool. We may or may not try to bolt this Cloud of Fae on the next turn. Cloud of Fae gets in, and what happens here is we see a Pauper, pretty standard threat. Ninja of the Deep Hours come out. We go ahead and bolt it. He counterspells again. This is his 3rd counterspell. We go ahead and draw, leaving open the City of Brass, because if we draw Swords to Plowshares or Lightning Bolt, we can cast it. We get lucky and draw one of the 6 cards in our deck we could have drawn there to get out of the situation. He goes ahead and gushes. We go ahead and Time Twister here, because he gushed, he's up on cards in hand to us. I figure Time Twistering makes sense there, because he's only going up 2 relative cards, and I'm going up 4, which seems good to me. So Relic of Progenitus is actually the best card against us he's cast to this point, because we can't go eternal anymore. Time Twister allows us to go infinite with this deck. We can never mill with it, or never. I'm sorry, not never mill. We can't. Yeah, we can never mill. We go ahead and cast the Time Walk out. He goes ahead and counters it, which actually I'm glad he does. Now what I end up doing here, so I'm trying to set up balance again, is I go ahead and fireball his whole board, so I can reduce my hand size before I utilize the balance on the following turn to win the game, or to, well, you'll see. So he goes ahead and gets rid of more of my cards using the Relic. We draw the card we wanted here, which is the Abyss. We play out the balance. It's pretty apparent that he has counter magic, so we just play it into the counter magic. And what our plan is to resolve the Abyss and then recall ditching the Tundra, basically going to 0 cards once balance is on the stack. So what we've tried to set up is a game state where our opponent has 0 cards in hand. We have James Day Tome, which allows us to draw 2 cards a turn. And the board is open with us on the Abyss, which means that if he plays 1 card a turn, it'll die. 1 creature card a turn, it'll die on his upkeep, and I'll be drawing 2 cards. At some point, I'm going to be able to draw into a Disrupting Scepter, which will allow me to ensure any counter magic he draws will get ditched out of his hand. Any creature he plays will get ditched down, or it'll get played and it'll die to the Abyss, and I'll be drawing 2 cards a turn until I draw enough Mishra's Factories to kill him, because my Fireball has been exiled at this point. And I no longer can continue to recurse the Fireball. So that's how the deck works. You'll see a quick concession after this. We did most of this damage to ourselves, but essentially we took him to prison on this deck and end up balancing him out here. We have to get rid of some of the Cities of Brass, but I have no problem getting rid of 2 Cities of Brass because they're frankly killing me faster than my opponent can. He goes ahead and looks with his Relic. We draw a land for the turn, and he goes ahead and concedes it because we've pretty much got him in lockdown at this point. So, why is this game interesting? Well, one, I think we kind of debunked that Pauper decks, could beat, an old school Magic deck, given this is kind of like the flagship standard of like the old school formats, the deck, originally designed by Brian Weissman back in the early 90s. But what's interesting to me is that the threats have just become so much exponentially better that really trying to play hard control without, some of the just horrifically busted cards that were made back when, Magic theory was much less understood. Card advantage, was still to kind of be unveiled. I think specifically unveiled by Brian Weissman himself, the inventor of this style of deck. I wouldn't even say if he was the inventor of it. He was really the one who gave voice to it and wrote prolifically on it to kind of explain it to people, because before that, most decks have just been combo or like crappy creature decks that could and tried to win fast, but if they failed to do that, then they would just lose. This deck actually has a decent bit of play to it, but where does control become more viable, I think, is kind of the big question. And I think when you start having cards like Library of Alexandria, when you have cards like the Abyss, when you have fast mana that allows you to do big things quickly that are overpowering. For instance, James Day Tome, you're able to eke out advantage because your cards are that much more powerful. We have balance, we have moat, and our removal is just so much exponentially better too, which is kind of another interesting side note. When you start looking at threats, vice removal nowadays, generally speaking, the best removal costs about the same as the creature you're killing with it or the permanent you're killing with it. Take, for instance, Abrupt Decay. At most, when you use an Abrupt Decay, at most, I'm not saying it's a bad card, but at most you're going to get a card that costs 1 more mana than Abrupt Decay. Does that make it a bad card? No, not at all. But look at that vice a card like Swords to Plowshares. Swords to Plowshares can target anything that does not have Shroud or Hexproof. It can target Blightsteel Colossus. And it'll get rid of it. That would be essentially in exchange for what I would say was generally going to be a Tinker plus a Sol Ring or something for 1 mana, just to get rid of it. That's an amazing rate. It's actually never been beat. Like, it is the best removal in the game, and this deck runs the best removal in the game. Now, I think what's interesting about that is when you start looking at like the origins of Magic, and I think in some ways it's intuitive. If you were to just look at it in a vacuum and not understand the game, it would seem to me like just trying to look outside of the game, that when you're going to make an answer card, the answer should intuitively cost less than whatever it's answering, because it's going to be less situationally good. But when you're answering, a Primeval Titan, or let's say a Force of Nature in Old School or something like that, or a Serendib, a Freet, for 1 mana, for their 3 mana, and basically their whole turn, you're acquiring basically a time walk, almost a mana drain, because you've only spent 1 mana and you can still do something with your turn. So you start looking at the exchange rate of removal of Vice threats, then you'll see why I think Control, at least back in the times of Old School, was a lot more viable. So the power and efficiency of removal and answers, plus the power of the restricted cards that were available at the time. With balance, I don't know how much card advantage we accrued with it. A lot in this game. We were able to answer every single threat our opponent was able to play, and eventually generate a game state where, they were going to be forced to leave counter magic in their hand, possibly leave threats in their hand, but if they're doing both, they're eventually just going to discard until they die. Now, could I overdraw and mill myself? Yeah, but I have Brain Geyser in this deck, and eventually I'll get to a game state where I'm able to protect all of my spells so I'm drawing more cards, and I'll Brain Geyser my opponent out. So I think this is actually very interesting, because you start looking at these two decks, and mine runs absolutely 0 creatures. Mishra's Factory is a win con, Lightning Bolt, recursed over and over again with Time Spiral as a win con, and then really Fireball or Brain Geyser, mill them out. But you start looking at this, and you can kind of understand, how different the game is now. You really don't even. It's rare that you can even play a viable Control deck anymore. More often than not, because the creatures are just so great in the game, you have to play them, and then back them up with the disruption, because the answers just aren't that good anymore. I would say that, if anything, the answers tend to emulate, to a lesser degree, with probably diminishing returns on it, the original removal that was ever printed in the first run of the game. So I hope you guys enjoyed this short video. I hope it kind of provided you some insight on what's interesting, because in a lot of ways there is power creep. It is very focused on permanence. I think, you look at creatures, you look at planeswalkers, which, planeswalkers really just are trumped-up creatures, at the end of the day, that accrue you value every single turn. They have grown exponentially in power. You look at the best cards that are in Old School that are creature permanents, they're not that good. Not that good at all. You look at the ones that are available now in Standard, Modern, they're ridiculous. A single Geist of St. Traff gets around the Abyss, and I just lose to it. I guess I could block it with a Mishra's Factory, but, I probably can't beat that card if it ever resolves. But you look at a deck like this, and, I have obviously the most busted mana ever made in the game. I have the most busted card drawing. James Tome, probably not as much, but it's what you had available to you. And just because of how good all that is, you're able to win with some stupid nonsense like a Mishra's Factory or a Fireball or Lightning Bolts over and over again. So if you guys enjoyed this short video series, I think it's interesting to see how some of these newer decks fare against some of the older decks, and how game theory in general has kind of changed. The design approach and the game theory has kind of changed for Magic the Gathering just in general. All right, guys, have a good evening and take care now.